Jessica Rodriguez had always believed in fighting for what was right. As a civil rights lawyer in the city of Riverside, she spent her days helping families who had nowhere else to turn. Her small office on Main Street wasn't much to look at, but it had become a beacon of hope for people who felt the system had failed them. 3 years ago, Jessica started noticing something troubling. Families kept coming to her with similar stories about their loved ones dying in police custody. The details were always different, but there was something that didn't add up about these cases. Police reports that seemed incomplete, medical examiners who rushed their findings, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories or disappeared altogether. The case that opened her eyes involved a young father named Daniel. He was only 28 years old when he died during what police called a routine traffic stop. According to the official report, Daniel had resisted arrest and injured himself while fighting with officers. But when Jessica looked at the autopsy photos, she saw injuries that told a different story. The medical examiner had found broken ribs, internal bleeding and bruising patterns that didn't match the police account. Daniel's family insisted he was not the type to fight with anyone, especially police officers. His wife Linda brought Jessica a video that Daniel had recorded on his phone just minutes before the traffic stop. In it, he was calm and cheerful, talking about picking up groceries for dinner. This wasn't a man who was about to violently resist arrest. Jessica filed a wrongful death lawsuit, but getting information from the police department felt like pulling teeth. Every request for records was met with delays, excuses, or outright refusal. The department claimed that releasing certain documents would interfere with ongoing investigations. But those investigations never seemed to reach any conclusions. As Jessica dug deeper into Daniel's case, she started reviewing other similar incidents from the past 5 years. A pattern began to emerge that made her stomach turn. The same group of officers appeared in report after report. Detective Ray Kowalski, Sergeant Mike Brennan, and Officer Tony Vasquez seemed to be involved in every suspicious incident that crossed her desk. These 3 officers had a reputation on the street. People in certain neighborhoods knew their names and feared them. Jessica heard stories from clients about aggressive traffic stops, searches without proper warrants, and arrests that seemed designed to intimidate rather than enforce the law. But until now, no one had connected all the dots. Jessica spent weeks going through public records, court filings, and news reports. She discovered that complaints against these officers had been filed dozens of times over the years, but they always seemed to disappear into the internal affairs process without any real consequences. The officers would receive a few days of administrative leave, maybe some additional training, and then they'd be back on the street. The more she learned, the more Jessica realized she wasn't just dealing with a few bad cops. This looked like an organized effort to cover up serious misconduct. Someone with power and influence was protecting these officers, making sure their actions never faced real scrutiny. Jessica's investigation led her to other lawyers who had tried to take on similar cases. Most of them had given up after hitting wall after wall of resistance. One attorney told her that he'd received threatening phone calls after filing a lawsuit against the police department. Another said her car had been vandalized multiple times while she was working on a police misconduct case. But Jessica wasn't easily intimidated. She had grown up in a neighborhood where people didn't trust the police, and she had seen firsthand how the system could fail ordinary citizens. Her own brother had been harassed by police officers when he was a teenager, stopped and searched multiple times for no reason other than walking through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. As Jessica continued building her case against the 3 officers, she noticed that she was being watched. A black sedan would park across from her office for hours at a time. When she left work, the same car would follow her for several blocks before turning away. At first, she thought she was being paranoid, but the surveillance became too obvious to ignore. Then strange things started happening. Her office building's security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned the same week she filed a major motion for police records. Her computer was hacked and someone tried to access her client files. Jessica started keeping backup copies of everything in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. The harassment escalated when Jessica's car was vandalized outside the courthouse. Someone had scratched deep gouges into the paint and slashed 2 tires. When she reported it to the police, the officer who took the report seemed more interested in what she was doing at the courthouse than in catching whoever had damaged her car. A week later, Jessica's office was broken into. The strange thing was that nothing valuable was stolen. Her computer, printer, and office equipment were all untouched, but several file cabinets had been pried open, and case files related to police misconduct were scattered across the floor. Some documents were missing entirely, including witness statements and medical records that would be difficult to replace. Jessica realized that someone was trying to sabotage her cases, but she couldn't prove who was behind it. The police investigation into the break-in went nowhere. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Williams, asked a few basic questions and then seemed to lose interest. He suggested that maybe Jessica had simply misplaced the missing documents. Despite the intimidation, Jessica pressed forward with her cases. She knew that backing down would mean that families like Daniel's would never get justice, but she also knew that she was dealing with people who were willing to break the law to protect themselves. The question was how far they would go to stop her. Jessica started varying her daily routine, taking different routes to work and changing her schedule unpredictably. She installed security cameras at her office and began carrying a small recording device wherever she went. If someone was watching her, she wanted to be ready. The breakthrough came when Linda, Daniel's widow, brought Jessica a flash drive that her husband had hidden in their home. On it were photos and videos that Daniel had secretly recorded during previous encounters with police. The images showed the same 3 officers engaging in behavior that was clearly outside proper procedures. In one video, Officer Vasquez was seen taking money from a man's wallet during a traffic stop. Another showed Detective Kowalski threatening a teenage boy who had been recording police activity with his phone. Most shocking of all was a recording of Sergeant Brennan bragging to another officer about how easy it was to make arrests stick when you knew the right people in the prosecutor's office. Jessica knew that these recordings could change everything, but she also knew that possessing them put her in even greater danger. The officers she was investigating weren't just corrupt. They were part of a network that had been operating with impunity for years, and now she had evidence that could bring them down. As Jessica sat in her office late one evening reviewing the new evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched again. The black sedan was back, parked under a streetlight where she could see it clearly. This time she could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat, looking directly at her office window. Jessica knew that her investigation had reached a turning point. She had the evidence she needed to expose the corruption, but she also knew that the people she was fighting had already shown they were willing to break the law to protect themselves. The question now was whether she could get the truth out before they found a way to stop her permanently. The phone call started at 3 in the morning. Jessica would be jolted awake by the shrill ring, only to hear heavy breathing or distorted voices on the other end. The callers never identified themselves, but their message was always the same: drop the cases or face the consequences. At first, Jessica tried to ignore the harassment. She changed her phone number twice, but somehow the calls always found her. The callers seemed to know details about her daily life that made her skin crawl. They knew what she had eaten for lunch, what route she had taken to work, even what she was wearing on specific days. The psychological pressure was taking its toll, but Jessica refused to give up. She had made a promise to the families she represented, and she wasn't going to break it because some corrupt officers were trying to scare her. But the intimidation campaign was just getting started. Linda, Daniel's widow, was the first client to experience retaliation. She was pulled over 4 times in 2 weeks for minor traffic violations that would normally result in warnings. Each time, the officers would take their time running her license, searching her car, and asking pointed questions about her relationship with Jessica. The message was clear. Associating with the lawyer would bring unwanted attention. Then Linda's teenage son was arrested at school on charges of possessing illegal substances. The boy insisted that the substances had been planted, and Linda believed him. Her son had never been in trouble before, was an honor student, and had plans to attend college on a scholarship. The timing of the arrest, just days before Linda was scheduled to give a deposition in her husband's case, seemed like more than a coincidence. Jessica watched in horror as her other clients began experiencing similar harassment. Mrs. Chen, whose son had died in police custody 2 years earlier, received multiple visits from code enforcement officers who claimed her house violated various municipal ordinances. The violations were minor and had existed for years without anyone caring. But suddenly they required immediate attention and expensive repairs. Another client, Robert Williams, found his small business subjected to surprise inspections from health department officials, fire marshals, and tax auditors. Each inspection found minor violations that resulted in fines and forced closures. Robert's restaurant, which had operated successfully for 15 years, was being systematically destroyed by bureaucratic harassment. The pattern was unmistakable, but proving it was nearly impossible. On paper, these all looked like routine law enforcement activities and regulatory compliance checks. The officers involved could always claim they were just doing their jobs. But the timing and coordination of these actions made it clear that this was an organized campaign of intimidation. Jessica realized that the corruption she was fighting went far beyond the three officers she had initially identified. Detective Kowalski, Sergeant Brennan, and Officer Vasquez had allies throughout the police department and in other city agencies. They had built a network of people who were willing to help them silence anyone who threatened their operation. As Jessica dug deeper into the connections between these officials, she discovered something even more disturbing. The three officers weren't just covering up their misconduct. They were running a criminal enterprise. Through her investigation, she learned that they had been taking bribes from local drug dealers, providing protection for illegal gambling operations, and even stealing money and property from crime scenes. The corruption had made them wealthy. Detective Kowalski owned 3 rental properties and drove a luxury car that should have been well beyond his police salary. Sergeant Brennan had recently purchased a boat and taken expensive vacations to Europe. Officer Vasquez had paid cash for his house and had investments that seemed inconsistent with his income. But their criminal activities went beyond simple greed. These officers had developed a sense of invincibility that made them dangerous to anyone who crossed them. They believed they were above the law, and their behavior reflected that arrogance. Jessica's investigation revealed that Captain Morrison, who supervised internal affairs investigations, was part of their network. This explained why complaints against the 3 officers always disappeared without meaningful consequences. Morrison had been actively suppressing investigations and destroying evidence that could implicate his officers. The corruption even reached into the prosecutor's office. Jessica discovered that Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had received substantial campaign contributions from businesses that were connected to the corrupt network. When Jessica tried to present evidence of police misconduct to Walsh's office, she was told that the cases lacked merit and wouldn't be pursued. The web of corruption was more extensive than Jessica had imagined, and she was beginning to understand why other lawyers had given up on similar cases. Fighting this network wasn't just about proving misconduct. It was about taking on an entire system that was designed to protect itself. But Jessica's determination only grew stronger as she learned more about the scope of the problem. She knew that if she didn't continue fighting, these corrupt officials would keep victimizing innocent people with impunity. The families she represented deserved justice, and she was their only hope of getting it. The harassment campaign against Jessica escalated when someone broke into her apartment while she was at work. Like the break-in at her office, nothing valuable was stolen, but her personal belongings had been searched and disturbed. The intruder had left subtle signs that they had been there: books out of place, drawers slightly open, papers scattered on her desk. The violation of her personal space was deeply unsettling, but it also confirmed that she was on the right track. The corrupt officers wouldn't be going to such lengths if they weren't worried about what she might uncover. Jessica installed security cameras in her apartment and began staying with friends on unpredictable schedules. Despite the pressure, Jessica continued building her cases. She interviewed witnesses who were afraid to speak publicly, but were willing to share information privately. She reviewed financial records that showed suspicious patterns in the officers' spending. She documented instances where evidence had mysteriously disappeared or been compromised. The breakthrough came when one of Officer Vasquez's former partners agreed to speak with Jessica confidentially. Officer Martinez had left the police force after becoming disgusted with the corruption he witnessed. He told Jessica about incidents where Vasquez had planted evidence, falsified reports, and taken money from people during arrests. Martinez also revealed that the 3 corrupt officers had been recording some of their illegal activities as insurance against each other. They each kept evidence of the other's crimes to ensure that no one would betray the group. If Jessica could find these recordings, she would have ironclad proof of their criminal enterprise. But getting access to such evidence would be nearly impossible without help from federal authorities. Local law enforcement couldn't be trusted and the prosecutor's office was compromised. Jessica realized that she needed to find a way to bring the FBI into the investigation. The decision to contact federal authorities was risky. If the corrupt officers learned that she was talking to the FBI, they might escalate their intimidation campaign or even resort to violence. But Jessica knew that she couldn't take down this network alone. She needed help from someone with the power and authority to investigate corruption at the local level. Jessica began researching FBI agents who specialized in public corruption cases. She learned about successful federal investigations into police corruption in other cities, and started looking for ways to make contact with the right people. She knew that she would need to present compelling evidence to convince federal authorities to get involved, but she believed she had enough documentation to make a strong case. As Jessica prepared to take this crucial step, the harassment against her clients intensified. Linda received a notice that her house was being foreclosed on, despite being current on her mortgage payments. Robert's restaurant was shut down indefinitely after a health inspection that found violations that seemed to appear overnight. Mrs. Chen was arrested on charges of welfare fraud that dated back several years and had never been investigated before. The message was clear. Jessica's clients were being punished for their association with her, and the punishment would continue until she dropped her cases. But instead of deterring Jessica, these actions only strengthened her resolve. She could see that the corrupt officers were becoming desperate, which meant they were worried about what she might accomplish. Jessica knew that the next phase of her investigation would be the most dangerous. She was about to challenge a network of corrupt officials who had shown they were willing to break any law to protect themselves. But she also knew that she was their greatest threat, and that gave her power she was determined to use. Jessica thought she had prepared for every possible escalation in the corrupt officers' intimidation campaign. She had security cameras, varied her routines, and kept backup copies of all her evidence in multiple locations. But she never imagined they would target her family directly. Her daughter Amy was 17 years old and had never been in any kind of trouble. She was an honor student, played violin in the school orchestra, and had already been accepted to 3 colleges. Amy was driving home from her part-time job at a local bookstore when she was pulled over by Officer Vasquez and another officer Jessica didn't recognize. According to Amy's tearful account, the traffic stop started normally. The officers claimed she had been speeding, which Amy insisted wasn't true. But when they searched her car, they allegedly found a bag of illegal substances hidden under the passenger seat. Amy swore she had never seen the bag before, and Jessica believed her daughter completely. The arrest was clearly designed to send Jessica a message. The substances found in Amy's car were exactly the type that would result in serious charges, including potential jail time and the loss of college scholarships. The timing was no coincidence either. It happened the same week Jessica had filed a major motion requesting internal affairs records on the 3 corrupt officers. Jessica's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She wanted to drop everything and focus solely on protecting her daughter. But she also knew that giving in to this intimidation would mean that other families would continue to suffer at the hands of these corrupt officers. The decision to continue fighting became even more personal and urgent. While Jessica was dealing with her daughter's arrest, she received an unexpected visit at her office. Detective Kowalski himself walked through her door, accompanied by 2 other officers she didn't recognize. He didn't bother with pleasantries or pretend that this was a social call. "Counselor Rodriguez," Kowalski said, settling into the chair across from her desk without being invited. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your future in this town." Jessica kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "If you want to talk to me, Detective, you can contact my attorney and schedule an appointment." Kowalski laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I think you misunderstand the situation here. Your daughter's in some serious trouble. Possession with intent to distribute is a felony charge. That's prison time, not to mention the end of her college plans." The threat was barely disguised. Jessica realized that Kowalski was offering her a deal. Drop her cases against the police department and maybe Amy's charges would disappear or be reduced to something manageable. But accepting such a deal would mean abandoning her clients and allowing the corruption to continue unchecked. "My daughter is innocent," Jessica said firmly, "and I'll prove it in court." "Evidence has a way of disappearing in this town," Kowalski replied with a smirk. "Witnesses forget what they saw. Video footage gets corrupted. Sometimes cases just fall apart for no apparent reason. The detective stood up to leave but paused at the door. Think about what's really important to you, counselor. Your daughter's future or some crusade that's going nowhere. You've got 48 hours to make the right choice. After Kowalski left, Jessica sat alone in her office, trying to process what had just happened. The corrupt officers had crossed a line by targeting Amy, but they had also revealed how desperate they were becoming. Their willingness to arrest an innocent teenager showed that they were running out of options and becoming increasingly reckless. That evening, Jessica's home was subjected to what police called a welfare check. Someone had reportedly called in a domestic violence incident at her address, claiming they had heard screaming and sounds of a struggle. When officers arrived, they insisted on searching the house to make sure everyone was safe. The search was thorough and invasive. Officers went through every room, opened every closet, and even searched through personal belongings. They claimed they were looking for signs of violence or weapons, but Jessica suspected they were really trying to find and confiscate any evidence she might have hidden at home. During the search, Sergeant Brennan made several pointed comments about how dangerous it could be for a single mother living alone. He mentioned how crime was increasing in her neighborhood and suggested that she might want to consider moving somewhere safer. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe as long as she continued her investigation. The welfare check lasted for over 3 hours, and neighbors gathered outside to watch the spectacle. Jessica realized that this was part of the intimidation strategy too. The corrupt officers wanted everyone to see that she was being investigated, creating doubt about her credibility and reputation in the community. But the harassment of Jessica's family was about to get worse. Amy received a notice that her acceptance to her first-choice college was being reconsidered due to her pending criminal charges. Her part-time job at the bookstore was terminated when the manager said he couldn't employ someone with legal troubles. Amy's friends began avoiding her, not wanting to be associated with someone who might be involved with illegal substances. Jessica watched her daughter's dreams crumbling and felt a rage building inside her that was different from anything she had experienced before. These corrupt officers weren't just attacking her, they were destroying an innocent teenager's future to protect their own criminal enterprise. The injustice was overwhelming, but it also clarified Jessica's resolve. She knew that the local system was completely compromised. The police department couldn't investigate itself, and the prosecutor's office was part of the problem. If she was going to get justice for her clients and protection for her family, she needed help from outside the local power structure. Jessica had been researching federal authorities for weeks, trying to find the right person to contact about the corruption in Riverside. She had learned about the FBI's public corruption unit and identified several agents who had successfully prosecuted similar cases in other cities. The decision to contact the FBI was terrifying because it meant crossing a point of no return. Once federal authorities became involved, there would be no going back to the way things were before. But Jessica realized that the way things were before wasn't acceptable anymore. Too many people had suffered and too many families had been denied justice. Jessica arranged to meet with Special Agent David Chen at a coffee shop in the next town over. She chose a public place where they were unlikely to be recognized, and she made sure she wasn't followed. The meeting felt like something out of a spy movie, but Jessica knew that the stakes were very real. Agent Chen was younger than Jessica had expected, but he had an intensity and focus that immediately impressed her. He listened carefully as she explained the pattern of corruption she had discovered, taking notes and asking pointed questions about specific incidents and evidence. "What you're describing sounds like a criminal conspiracy," Agent Chen said after Jessica had finished her presentation. "But building a federal case takes time, and these officers seem to be escalating their intimidation tactics. Are you prepared for what might happen if they find out you're talking to us?" Jessica thought about her daughter sitting at home, worried about her future and confused about how her life had suddenly fallen apart. She thought about Linda, whose family had been torn apart by her husband's death and who was now facing financial ruin. She thought about all the other families who had suffered at the hands of these corrupt officers. "I'm already living with the consequences of fighting them," Jessica replied. "At least with federal help, there's a chance of actually winning." Agent Chen explained that the FBI would need to conduct its own investigation before taking any action. They would need to gather evidence, verify Jessica's claims, and build a case that would stand up in federal court. The process could take months, and Jessica would need to continue her normal activities while secretly cooperating with the investigation. The most important thing is that you don't change your behavior in any way that might alert them to our involvement, Agent Chen warned. They're already watching you closely, and any deviation from your normal routine could raise suspicions. Jessica agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, but she also made it clear that her daughter's safety was her top priority. Agent Chen assured her that the FBI would monitor the situation closely and intervene if necessary to protect Jessica's family. As Jessica left the coffee shop that day, she felt a mixture of hope and fear. For the first time in months, she wasn't fighting alone. The FBI had resources and authority that could match the corrupt officers' network of influence. But she also knew that the most dangerous phase of the battle was just beginning. The corrupt officers had shown that they were willing to target innocent family members to achieve their goals. They had demonstrated that they had allies throughout local government who would help them intimidate and harass their opponents. But they had also revealed their desperation and their fear of exposure. Jessica returned home to find Amy studying at the kitchen table, trying to maintain some normalcy despite the chaos surrounding her life. As she looked at her daughter, Jessica made a silent promise that she would see this fight through to the end, no matter what it cost her personally. The corrupt officers had made their biggest mistake when they targeted her family, because now Jessica had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Special Agent David Chen returned to his office after meeting with Jessica and immediately began planning what would become one of the most complex public corruption investigations in the FBI's regional office history. He had been working public corruption cases for 8 years, but the scope of what Jessica had described was staggering. Chen started by assembling a team of agents and analysts who specialized in different aspects of federal crime. Agent Patricia Williams would handle the financial investigation, tracking the corrupt officers' money and assets. Agent Michael Torres would focus on the civil rights violations and excessive force cases. Analyst Rebecca Foster would coordinate surveillance and communications intercepts. The team's first task was to verify Jessica's claims independently. They couldn't build a federal case based solely on one person's accusations, no matter how compelling the evidence seemed. Chen knew that defense attorneys would attack Jessica's credibility, especially given her obvious motivation to discredit the officers she was suing. Agent Williams began by examining financial records for Detective Kowalski, Sergeant Brennan, and Officer Vasquez. What she found confirmed Jessica's suspicions and revealed even more concerning patterns. All 3 officers had bank accounts, investments, and assets that far exceeded what their police salaries could support. Detective Kowalski had made several large cash deposits over the past 2 years, always just under the amount that would trigger automatic federal reporting requirements. His mortgage payments suggested an income nearly double his actual police salary. Sergeant Brennan had purchased a boat worth more than his annual salary and had taken expensive vacations that he paid for in cash. Officer Vasquez's financial profile was the most suspicious. He had paid cash for his house, avoided any traditional loans or credit, and seemed to conduct most of his financial business through a network of shell companies and third-party payments. The pattern suggested someone who was deliberately trying to hide the source of his income. While Agent Williams followed the money trail, Agent Torres began investigating the civil rights violations that Jessica had documented. He started by reviewing federal databases for complaints and lawsuits involving the 3 officers, but he quickly discovered that many incidents had never been reported to federal authorities. Torres reached out to other attorneys who had represented clients in cases involving police misconduct in Riverside. Most were reluctant to talk at first, but as word spread that the FBI was interested, more lawyers began sharing information about suspicious cases and patterns of behavior they had observed. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than what Jessica had initially reported. The 3 corrupt officers weren't just covering up individual incidents of misconduct. They were running a systematic operation that involved multiple types of criminal activity. Chen decided to implement surveillance on the 3 officers to document their current activities and build evidence of ongoing crimes. This was a delicate operation because the targets were experienced law enforcement officers who would be alert to surveillance techniques. The FBI team used a combination of physical surveillance, electronic monitoring, and undercover operations to gather evidence. They tracked the officers' movements during their shifts and off-duty hours, documenting meetings with known criminals and suspicious financial transactions. One of the most shocking discoveries came when surveillance revealed that Sergeant Brennan was regularly meeting with a local drug dealer named Carlos Mendez. The meetings took place in parking lots and back alleys, and money was clearly changing hands. When the FBI investigated Mendez's operation, they found that he had been operating with virtual impunity for years, despite being well known to local police. The surveillance also revealed that Detective Kowalski was involved in a protection racket involving several local businesses. Restaurant owners, shopkeepers, and other small business operators were paying him monthly fees to ensure that their establishments weren't subjected to excessive police attention or regulatory harassment. Officer Vasquez's activities were the most violent and concerning. The FBI documented several instances where he used excessive force during arrests, particularly when dealing with people who might have information about police misconduct. On one occasion, surveillance footage showed him threatening a potential witness with arrest if they spoke to lawyers about police behavior. As the evidence mounted, Chen realized that the corruption went beyond the 3 officers Jessica had identified. Captain Morrison, who supervised internal affairs, was clearly involved in covering up their activities. The FBI intercepted communications showing that Morrison had been actively suppressing investigations and destroying evidence. The investigation also revealed connections to the prosecutor's office. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had been receiving regular payments from a consulting company that was funded by the corrupt officer's criminal enterprise. In exchange, she had been dismissing charges against their criminal associates and refusing to prosecute cases that might expose their activities. Chen knew that they needed to move carefully to avoid alerting the targets to the federal investigation. The corrupt officers had shown they were willing to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence, so any premature action could jeopardize the entire case. Meanwhile, Jessica continued her legal work while secretly cooperating with the FBI investigation. She wore recording devices during several meetings with local officials, capturing conversations that provided crucial evidence of the conspiracy. The recordings revealed how extensively the corruption had penetrated local government. In one particularly damning recording, Captain Morrison admitted to Jessica that he knew about problems with his officers, but said that sometimes you have to look the other way to keep the peace. And he also revealed that pressure from higher up had influenced his decisions about which cases to investigate. Another recording captured Walsh discussing a case involving one of the corrupt officers. Walsh acknowledged that the evidence suggested misconduct but said that prosecuting police officers was politically complicated and that she had to consider the bigger picture when making charging decisions. The FBI investigation took on added urgency when surveillance revealed that the corrupt officers were becoming increasingly paranoid and desperate. They had noticed that some of their criminal associates were being arrested by federal agents, and they were beginning to suspect that someone was providing information to authorities. Detective Kowalski was recorded telling Sergeant Brennan that they needed to clean house and eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to their operation. The conversation included specific references to Jessica and suggestions about how they might escalate their intimidation campaign against her. Chen realized that Jessica and her family were in immediate danger. The corrupt officers were discussing actions that went far beyond harassment and intimidation. They were talking about permanently silencing the threat that Jessica represented to their criminal enterprise. The FBI moved quickly to provide protection for Jessica and her daughter while continuing to gather evidence for prosecution. Undercover agents were positioned to monitor Jessica's movements and intervene if necessary. Electronic surveillance of the corrupt officers was intensified to track any plans for violence. As the investigation progressed, more victims came forward with information about the corrupt officers' activities. Business owners admitted to paying protection money. Drug dealers provided information about their arrangements with police. Even some current police officers began cooperating with the investigation, disgusted by what they had witnessed. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but Chen knew that building a federal case required absolute precision. Defense attorneys would scrutinize every aspect of the investigation, looking for procedural errors or constitutional violations that could result in evidence being suppressed. The breakthrough came when Officer Vasquez's paranoia led him to betray his own partners. Believing that Detective Kowalski was planning to blame him for their criminal enterprise, Vasquez approached a federal agent and offered to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Vasquez provided the FBI with locations where the corrupt officers had hidden evidence of their crimes, including recordings they had made of each other as insurance against betrayal. These recordings contained explicit discussions of criminal activities, including plans to frame innocent people and eliminate witnesses. With this evidence in hand, Chen began preparing for the arrests that would end the corrupt officers' criminal enterprise. The timing had to be perfect to prevent the destruction of evidence and ensure the safety of witnesses and victims. Jessica was informed that the arrests were imminent, but she was warned that the danger to her family might actually increase in the short term. Desperate criminals often took extreme actions when they realized their freedom was about to end. The FBI positioned additional agents to protect Jessica and Amy during the critical period leading up to the arrests. As Chen reviewed the evidence his team had gathered, he was amazed by the scope of the corruption they had uncovered. What had started as an investigation into police misconduct had revealed a criminal conspiracy that involved dozens of people and had been operating for years. The corrupt officers had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, violated the civil rights of countless citizens, and perverted the justice system to protect themselves and their criminal associates. But their reign of terror was about to end, and the families they had victimized would finally have a chance at justice. Chen knew that the arrests would send shockwaves through the Riverside Police Department and local government. Many people had known about the corruption, but had chosen to look the other way or actively participate in covering it up. The federal investigation would expose not just the crimes themselves, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. As the team made final preparations for the arrests, Chen reflected on Jessica's courage in coming forward, despite the obvious danger to herself and her family. Without her willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, the corrupt officers would have continued their criminal enterprise indefinitely, and countless more families would have suffered injustice. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning in March, coordinated with military precision across multiple locations throughout Riverside. Special Agent Chen had spent weeks planning every detail to ensure that none of the corrupt officers could escape or destroy evidence. At exactly 6 a.m, federal agents surrounded Detective Kowalski's house while he was having breakfast with his family. The detective who had terrorized witnesses and victims for years was caught completely off guard, arrested in his bathrobe while his neighbors watched from their windows. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Kowalski, who had conducted so many aggressive early morning raids himself, was now experiencing the same treatment. Sergeant Brennan was arrested at the police station as he arrived for his shift. Fellow officers watched in stunned silence as federal agents led their supervisor away in handcuffs. Many of them had suspected that something wasn't right with Brennan's activities, but seeing him arrested by the FBI drove home the reality of how serious the situation had become. Officer Vasquez was taken into custody during a traffic stop that he thought was routine. Federal agents had coordinated with local police to pull him over on a minor violation, then revealed their true purpose when he stepped out of his vehicle. Vasquez had been cooperating with the investigation, but his arrest was necessary to maintain the appearance that all the corrupt officers were being treated equally. Captain Morrison was arrested while jogging in the park near his home. His morning exercise routine interrupted by federal agents who had been tracking his movements for weeks. The man who had spent years covering up police misconduct was now facing his own criminal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh was arrested at her office. Federal agents entering the courthouse with warrants that sent shockwaves through the legal community. Her involvement in the corruption scandal was particularly damaging, because prosecutors are supposed to be the guardians of justice, not participants in criminal conspiracies. The simultaneous arrests were designed to prevent any of the conspirators from warning the others or attempting to flee. Within 2 hours, the entire leadership of the corrupt network was in federal custody, facing charges that could result in decades in prison. Jessica watched the news coverage of the arrests from her office, feeling a mixture of relief, vindication, and overwhelming emotion. For months, she had been fighting what seemed like an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. Now the corrupt officers who had terrorized her family and countless others were finally being held accountable. The evidence that the FBI had gathered was staggering in its scope and detail. Federal prosecutors announced that they had documented over 200 separate criminal acts by the corrupt officers, including civil rights violations, racketeering, drug trafficking, extortion, and obstruction of justice. Detective Kowalski was charged with operating a criminal enterprise under the federal RICO statute, the same law typically used to prosecute organized crime families. The evidence showed that he had been the leader of a conspiracy that had generated over $500,000 in illegal proceeds while victimizing dozens of innocent people. Sergeant Brennan faced charges related to his protection of drug dealers and his involvement in evidence tampering. Federal prosecutors revealed that he had been selling seized drugs back onto the street through a network of criminal informants, essentially operating as a drug dealer while wearing a police badge. Officer Vasquez was charged with multiple civil rights violations for his use of excessive force against suspects and witnesses. Despite his cooperation with the investigation, the severity of his crimes meant that he still faced significant prison time, though prosecutors agreed to recommend a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. Captain Morrison's charges focused on his systematic obstruction of justice and his role in covering up the crimes of his subordinates. The FBI had documented instances where Morrison had destroyed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and falsified internal affairs reports to protect the corrupt officers. ADA Walsh faced charges for her violation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy, and accepting bribes. Her law license was immediately suspended, and she faced the possibility of being permanently disbarred even if she avoided prison time. The arrests triggered a comprehensive review of every case that had involved the corrupt officers over the past 5 years. Federal prosecutors announced that dozens of convictions would likely be overturned due to evidence tampering, perjury, and constitutional violations. People who had been sitting in prison based on falsified evidence were suddenly seeing their cases dismissed and their freedom restored. Linda, Daniel's widow, finally saw justice for her husband's death. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that Daniel had been killed during an arrest that was conducted specifically to prevent him from testifying about police misconduct he had witnessed. His death hadn't been an accident or the result of resistance. It had been murder designed to silence a potential witness. Amy's charges were immediately dismissed when federal prosecutors revealed that the substances found in her car had been planted by Officer Vasquez. Security camera footage from a nearby business had captured Vasquez placing something in Amy's vehicle before conducting the traffic stop. Amy's college acceptance was reinstated, and her scholarship was restored. The impact of the federal investigation extended far beyond the immediate arrests. A federal judge appointed a special monitor to oversee the Riverside Police Department, while comprehensive reforms were implemented. New policies were put in place for handling complaints, conducting internal investigations, and ensuring accountability for officer misconduct. Jessica was appointed to serve on the Civilian Review Board that would oversee police reform efforts. Her experience fighting corruption and her understanding of how the system had failed made her an ideal advocate for meaningful change. She used her position to ensure that the voices of victims and their families were heard in the reform process. The trial of the corrupt officers became a media sensation, with national news organizations covering the proceedings and highlighting the systematic nature of the corruption that had been exposed. The case became a landmark example of how federal intervention could break cycles of local corruption that had seemed impossible to address through normal channels. Detective Kowalski's trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of his criminal enterprise. Wiretap recordings played in court captured him discussing bribes, planning evidence tampering, and threatening witnesses. Financial records showed the flow of illegal money through his accounts. Former victims testified about the intimidation and violence they had experienced. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Kowalski was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, ensuring that he would spend most of his remaining life behind bars. The judge noted during sentencing that Kowalski had betrayed the public trust in the most fundamental way possible. Sergeant Brennan received 18 years after being convicted on drug trafficking and conspiracy charges. The evidence showed that he had been responsible for putting illegal drugs back onto the street, while simultaneously arresting other people for drug offenses. His hypocrisy and corruption had directly contributed to the drug problems that plagued the community. Officer Vasquez's cooperation with the investigation earned him a reduced sentence of 8 years, though he still faced significant prison time for his civil rights violations. His testimony had been crucial in convicting the other defendants. But the judge made clear that cooperation couldn't completely excuse the severity of his crimes. Captain Morrison was sentenced to 12 years for his role in covering up the conspiracy and obstructing justice. The judge noted that Morrison's position of authority made his crimes particularly serious, as he had been responsible for ensuring accountability within the police department, but had instead enabled criminal behavior, ADA. Walsh received 6 years in prison and was permanently disbarred from practicing law. Her corruption had undermined the integrity of the entire justice system, and the judge emphasized that prosecutors who violate their oath face enhanced punishment because of the trust placed in them by society. The federal settlements for the victims of police misconduct totaled over $10 million, paid by the city of Riverside and its insurance carriers. Linda received a substantial settlement for her husband's wrongful death, providing financial security for her family and acknowledging the injustice they had suffered. Jessica's legal practice flourished as word spread about her role in exposing the corruption. Families from other cities began seeking her help with similar cases, and she became a nationally recognized expert on police misconduct litigation. But more importantly to her, the reforms implemented in Riverside were working to prevent future corruption. The case had lasting implications beyond Riverside. Federal prosecutors in other jurisdictions began looking more closely at patterns of police misconduct in their own areas. Several similar investigations were launched, based on the techniques and legal theories that had been successful in the Riverside case. Jessica often reflected on the journey that had led from her initial investigation into Daniel's death to the comprehensive federal prosecution that had brought down an entire criminal network. The price had been high, with months of intimidation and danger for her family. But the results had justified the sacrifice. The corrupt officers who had once seemed untouchable were now serving long prison sentences. The families they had victimized had received justice and compensation. The police department was under federal oversight and implementing meaningful reforms. And most importantly, future potential victims were protected by a system that was now accountable and transparent. On quiet evenings in her office, Jessica would sometimes think about all the other families in other cities who might be facing similar corruption and injustice. She hoped that the Riverside case would inspire other lawyers to take on seemingly impossible fights against corruption, knowing that with persistence, courage, and federal support, even the most entrenched criminal networks could be brought to justice. The case had proven that no one is above the law, no matter how much power or influence they believe they possess. Justice might be delayed, but it could not be denied forever when people were willing to fight for what was right.